At a camp in the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1943, German prisoners of war ate beef, white bread, and real coffee. A few miles down the road, the families close enough to see the camp's floodlights at night were rationing sugar by the spoonful and trading stamps out of a book for a pound of meat. The captives knew about the gap. The War Department did more than let them write home and describe it. It had reasons to want those letters to land in Germany. Every word a man wrote was read first. The mail left the compounds under guard, travelled to New York, and crossed the desk of a censor before it ever reached the Atlantic. The office that did the reading had grown from a handful of clerks slitting envelopes in the days after Pearl Harbor into a small army of examiners, thousands of them, working through the enemy's correspondence at long tables. Escape plans came out. Anything that named a troop movement, a factory, a stretch of coastline, a ship in a harbour, went back to the writer blacked over or sliced away with a razor. A captive could put almost anything on the page about the people holding him. What he could not write was where he sat or what he had seen on the road that brought him there. The part the readers left alone was the part that mattered to Washington most. A young soldier out of the Africa Corps describing the meat on his plate, the films on Saturday night, the soccer pitch behind the wire, was writing the exact letter the United States wanted his mother in Hamburg to open. The flood that filled those camps had a date. On the 13th of May, 1943, the Axis armies in Tunisia gave up, and about 250,000 men, the bulk of them German, walked into captivity inside a single week. The Allies had nowhere on that continent to hold them, and no food to spare in a theatre already short of it. So the empty cargo ships steaming back toward American ports carried the prisoners west as ballast. One of them later remembered the heat of the journey across the United States. The windows of the rail car cracked open a few inches against the Texas summer. The sweat ran into our shoes. The food on the train, he allowed, was good, and there was plenty of it. He had not expected that. Camps went up fast to receive them, better than 600 before the end, set down across 45 states. Texas took more than any other, close to 1/10 of the whole. The difference between one of these places and an ordinary army post came down to a few things. Watchtowers, a double belt of wire, floodlights, and at some camps, dogs. Inside, a pot-bellied stove stood in the centre aisle of each tar paper hut. To see why Washington cared so much about the mail, it helps to know where the war's other letters were going. On the 1st of November 1945, the count stood at 92,965 Americans in German hands. Better than 30,000 were airmen, shot down over the Reich and marched into compounds the Luftwaffe ran for its own purposes. The rest were ground troops, most taken in the last hard winter of the fighting. Their captors kept them in the east of the country, far from France, to make a home run harder for any man who got over the wire. They wrote home too, on stiff printed forms handed across a counter, and what they put down was thinner. They were hungry. They lived and sometimes died by the Red Cross parcels that arrived late or not at all, and when the parcels stopped, the men began to starve. Morale in the camps rose and fell on two things: whether the mail got through and what the German newspapers said about strikes back in the United States. News of a Labour walkout at home could send a barracks into a black mood, men wondering aloud whether the country they were waiting to return to had the stomach to win. At one camp, an officer's compound called Oflag 64, the senior American put a complaint in writing to the State Department, and it was not about the Germans. It was about the slowness of his own side's censors in New York, who sat on the letters that would tell wives and mothers their men were still breathing. Two prison systems faced each other across an ocean, and the men inside them were, in the coldest accounting, money. Here the story tends to get told as kindness, and the kindness was partly true. The United States held to the Geneva Convention of 1929 down to the small print. The treaty said an enemy soldier in a nation's hands had to be fed, housed and paid on the same footing as that nation's own troops, and the army complied. Captured Germans drew 80 cents a day in scrip they spent at the canteen. They had libraries and language classes. They put on plays, formed orchestras, painted the flat Texas landscape, and ran a soccer league with printed standings. At Camp Herne, the men built a small castle out of scrap and concrete and named it for a fortress back home. And as the war pulled American men overseas and left the farms short-handed, the War Department turned the prisoners loose into the fields under light guard, where they picked cotton and cut timber and worked the canneries for the going wage in coupons. A farmer who had cursed the camp in the spring found himself glad of it by harvest. It looked like decency. Decency does not explain it. The policy had a target, and the target was not the man behind the wire. It was a woman in Germany reading a letter at her kitchen table, and the government standing behind her, weighing how to handle the American boys it held. A well-fed soldier writing home from Texas was a letter to Berlin as much as to his kin. The message under the soccer scores and the descriptions of breakfast ran plain. Their sons were safe in the hands of the enemy, which handed the regime every reason to keep the favour running the other way. The Germans worked the same arithmetic. Hermann Goering ran the Air Force, and the Air Force ran the camps that held downed Allied flyers. He kept those men in better conditions than the army gave to captured ground troops, and the reason was not chivalry. It was the Luftwaffe pilots sitting in Allied cages. He was guarding his own through the bodies of other people's sons. The same machine, aimed the other way. These videos take real research, and that work keeps going when people decide it matters. If you want more of it, hit subscribe. The trouble began the moment the clean idea on paper touched the ground. The first trouble came from the home front. Word got around about the food. Mail arrived at newspapers from citizens who had sons overseas and ration books in the kitchen drawer, and they did not care to hear that captured Germans in Texas ate steak while a housewife in Ohio surrendered points for a can of peaches. That March, the government had put canned goods under the knife, 48 points a month per person, with canned meat and fish often gone from the shelves outright. People could count. Some camps picked up a nickname that has stuck for 80 years. They called them the Fritz Ritz. How soft the camps truly were is a question historians still fight over. Gregory Sumner, who wrote a book on the Michigan compounds, calls the outrage overblown, and the barracks closer to bear than to plush. The men slept on cots around that pot-bellied stove in a draughty hut behind 2 rows of wire, and a prison was still a prison. What set the place apart in his reading was not luxury at all. It was the one thing the men on the far side of the ocean did without. There was food. The Americans wasting away in German camps were wasting away because Germany had begun to run out of everything, its own people included. So the press got its scandal and the politicians got their headache, and the policy held regardless. The men in Washington running it were not thinking about the housewife in Ohio. They were thinking about the 90,000. The second trouble was worse, and it lived inside the wire, where the guards could not see it, and in some cases chose not to look. A compound was not empty of command just because the army held the keys. German officers and sergeants ran the day-to-day order of their own men, and inside that order a second authority operated, loyal not to the camp commander but to the Reich. It kept its own court. A man who said the wrong thing, wrote the wrong thing, or leaned the wrong way became its business, and its sentences were not for show. In a camp dropped into the Kansas cornfields in the autumn of 1943, a man turned up dead after word spread that he kept a diary doubting the war. He had set down a fear that the party would be the ruin of his country. The secret court convened, judged him, and pressed him until he hanged himself. A second man at the same place met the same end. The same thing surfaced in camp after camp. In Oklahoma, a knot of diehards beat a soldier to death after he slipped the Americans a note marking bombing targets back home. In Arizona, 7 submariners strung up a U-boat man who had turned informer, while in Arkansas a prisoner was killed for the plain offence of working harder than the rules required. A rumour was enough on its own. In South Carolina, a man was strangled in the dark over talk that he had grown friendly with his guards. Priests took beatings for refusing to bow to the party, and men went at one another with planks studded with nails and razor blades. Set those killings beside the mail policy, and the whole thing turns cold. The United States was inviting men to write home without restriction, and inside the same fences a self-appointed Gestapo was killing them over what they wrote. A letter doubting the war could reach a censor in New York, and a tribunal in Barracks 9 on the same afternoon. The openness that served the policy so well in Berlin gave no cover at all to the man holding the pen. He was free to write what he pleased, and free to die for it, under American floodlights, watched by sentries who had been told to keep order and little else. The sentries kept order. Order and safety turned out to be different things. The army learned of some of it. Investigations followed, and after the shooting stopped, a number of captives stood trial for murders done behind the wire. Several climbed the gallows at Fort Leavenworth, and their executions were held back, and the reason for the delay says everything about how the machine ran. Washington was sitting on the condemned Germans as leverage, ticking their names off a list to make certain its own condemned men in German custody came home first. Even at the rope, the prisoners were still money, and the ledger stayed open until the last American was confirmed out of danger. Held up against the Eastern Front, all of this belongs to another world. The Germans who fell into Soviet hands died in the hundreds of thousands, in the wire and on the roads and in the snow of a captivity that kept no ledgers and answered to no inspector. The ones who surrendered to the Americans came home. The reciprocity machine, ugly as its logic was, had done the job it was built to do. The men in German hands had it worse than the Germans in American hands, and nobody on either side bothered to pretend otherwise. Even so, Germany kept to the treaty for its Western prisoners more than it broke it. A Red Cross inspector could walk a camp. The mail moved, slow and cut on both ends, but it moved. And when the fighting stopped, the men who had gone hungry in those eastern compounds came out the far side, thin and bitter and, in the great majority, alive. There is a pull, telling this, toward rounding it off into a tidy verdict about decency coming out on top. The record will not round. What the record holds is colder and harder to sit with. The policy worked. The letters did their job. A German soldier's account of his breakfast was one thread in a net stretched across an ocean to catch falling American boys, and the net, for the most part, held. By 1946, the compounds stood empty. The 400,000 went back to a country in rubble, where the food they had written home about did not exist and the streets they had left were gone. A few of them did not want to go. A handful had spent 2 years learning a different country and decided they liked it better than the one waiting for them. About 860 never left at all. They lie at 43 sites across the United States, men carried off in the camps by accidents and sickness, and in a few cases by one another. The highest in rank among them, a general named Willibald Borowitz, died in a car wreck in the summer of 1945 and rests at Fort Benning under a German flag no bigger than a sheet of paper. And here the story refuses to close. The men came back, not as captives, as old men, decades on, crossing the same ocean to walk the ground where the wire used to run. One of them, Günter Grewe, returned to the post outside Tacoma where he had been held, found the corner of a barracks where his bunk once stood and pointed at it. He carried no grievance. By his own telling, he had nothing but good things to say about the country that had locked him away. German diplomats have stood at the graves at Fort Benning and thanked America for caring for enemy soldiers after everything their nation had done. The gratitude is real, and it has been real for 80 years. It was also the entire point. The kindness those men remember was engineered in part to keep other men alive on the far side of a war, and the machinery ran so well that the people on the receiving end never stopped being grateful for it. Their captors treated them well, so that someone else's sons would be treated well in turn. They wrote home and said how good they had it because that was the precise thing Washington was hoping they would do, and every word of it they meant.